Welcome everybody to today's Northrop Frye lecture to be delivered by Professor Denise Ferreira da Silva, who is director of the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at University of British Columbia. And today's lecture is one of our Northrop Frye lectures. And I wanted to say a little bit about the Northrop Frye professorship. Frye founded the program in comparative literature at the University of Toronto in 1969, a program that later became institutionalized as our current Center for Comparative Literature and was the first home of the discipline in Canada. The visiting professorship was set up early on in Frye's name and has been occupied by eminent theorists and more recently by scholar poets. Holders of the Frye professorship all take theory very seriously, looking beyond the interpretation of specific texts to broader theoretical concerns of culture, politics, ethics, and aesthetics. Professor Ferreira da Silva actually began her Northrop Frye visiting professorship in the spring of 2020, 2 years ago, teaching a course for CompLit entitled Corpus Infinitum, Exploration on Subjectivity, the Body, Art, and the Possibility of Justice, a course that engaged broadly with the figuring of the human, challenging post-Enlightenment architectures of subjectivity predicated on rigid gender and racial norms through close engagement with Black feminist theory. From the enthusiastic accounts of the students who were lucky enough to attend this course, it was a memorable, transformative experience. While the course was supposed to have been delivered in person, like everything else that spring, it was instead taught online, with Professor Ferreira da Silva remaining at UBC. She was also supposed to have delivered this public lecture as part of her Northrop Frye professorship. We optimistically put it off for a year, thinking she would finally get to really come to Toronto. But alas, last spring, both the pandemic and the censure prevented her from speaking either online or in person. Well, we finally have her here, even if it is online. And I know the lecture will have been well worth the wait. So I'd like to welcome Professor Ferreira da Silva today. And before we kind of launch into her presentation, I'd like to call on two people. First, Professor Sarah Dowling, our colleague in comparative literature, to present an acknowledgement of the Indigenous land on which we are having this event take place. And then I will call on Corinne Gerbert, one of our doctoral students, who was one of those lucky people who got to take Professor da Silva's her course in spring of 2020. So Sarah, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jill, and hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm very happy to be able to offer a land acknowledgement. If we were hosting this talk in person at the University of Toronto, I would probably use the U of T's official land acknowledgement, which was developed in consultation with First Nations House, the Elders Circle, some scholars in the field, and senior university officials. And it goes like this. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Of course, when we meet electronically, as we're doing today, many of us are not present on the land on which the University of Toronto operates. I, for example, am speaking to you from Hamilton, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, the Neutral, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas. This land, like Toronto, is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources of the Great Lakes. It's also covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. No doubt many of you are situated in other territories still. And we should bear in mind that the resources powering our virtual platform have also been extracted from particular territories, often invisible to us, and that the peoples of those territories continue to feel the effects of this extraction. So before we begin, we acknowledge these many lands and the peoples to whom they should be returned. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay. Corinne?
Okay. So I'm just going to do a short introduction. In a 2014 essay, Denise Ferreira da Silva introduced the practice of a Black feminist poetics. And poethics is a compound of poetics and ethics. In the essay, Professor da Silva considered how a Black feminist poethics would go about the task to articulate the philosophical assumptions behind its praxis. She asked, I quote, "Would the poet's intention emancipate the category of Blackness from the scientific and historical ways of knowing that produced this category in the first place?" End quote. In the wake of the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the killing of Trayvon Martin, Professor da Silva concluded that the task is to target the very mode of representation that provides the meanings to Blackness as a referent of commodity, an object, and the other. In this way, a Black feminist poethics announces a whole range of possibilities for knowing, doing, and existing. Accordingly, Professor da Silva's theoretical work consists in the formulation of a critical strategy and global historical analysis, which highlights the centrality of raciality in post-Enlightenment thought. Because it is this thought which brought forward the representative mode of Blackness, which continues to operate in the present global, juridical, economic, and symbolic configuration. This reliance of modern thought on raciality is frequently ignored in liberal and contemporary critical theorizing, including at Victoria College. In order to change this fact, Denise Ferreira da Silva contributed to emancipating Blackness from the scientific and historical ways of knowing that produced its category in the following ways. She is the author of Toward a Global Idea of Race, which was published by University of Minnesota Press in 2007, and the co-editor with Paula Chakravarti of Race, Empire, and the Crisis of the Subprime. This was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2013. In 2019, Oficina da Imaginação Política, in collaboration with Living Commons, published A Dívida Impagável, which is a compilation of previously published texts, including the essay with the same title, which was published in English as Unpayable Debt in the Documenta 14 reader in 2017. An expanded version of this essay, which is also titled Unpayable Debt, will be published by Sternberg Press with MIT Press in May of this year, so in a few months. This is the work of which we will hear more today. Professor da Silva's many articles have been published in leading interdisciplinary journals. Her artistic works include the films Serpent Rain, Forwarder's Deep Implicancy, and Suit Breath, Corpus Infinitum, in collaboration with Arjuna Newman, and the relational art practices, Poetical Readings, and Sensing Salon, in collaboration with Valentina Desideri. In 2020, she curated the online exhibition openjustice.ca together with Ronald Rose Antoinette. She has exhibited and lectured at major art venues in Europe and the Americas. In addition, Professor da Silva has created important venues for the theorizing of global justice, including the Critical and Creative Social Justice Studies research stream at the University of British Columbia, where she is both a professor and a director. She is a member of the SHERC's newly formed advisory committee to address anti-Black racism and the Sharjah Working Group on the Rights of Future Generations. She is also an adjunct professor at the Department of Fine Art at Monash University in Melbourne and a member of several boards, including the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, the International Consortium for Critical Theory Programs, and the journals Postmodern Culture, social identities, and dark matter. I trust that the Center for Comparative Literature will pick up on the task of sustaining this tremendous work by focusing on inviting permanent Black feminist professor and studentship, so that a Black feminist poetics may continue to institute a whole range of possibilities for knowing, doing, and existing. With that, I pass to Professor Da Silva.
Very nice. Well, thank you. Well, thank you all for being here, and thanks, many thanks, Corinne, for this very kind introduction, and also thank Jill for the previous introduction to the professorship, and Sarah for this land acknowledgement. It was very important. And then I would like to thank Jill Paula Bao for organizing my visit back in 2020, my remote visit back then, and my remote lecture this time. And I would like also to acknowledge and thank the Musqueam people, to whom I am grateful for generously hosting me as I live and work on their unceded ancestral lands, while we deal with ongoing daily and the consequences of historical, colonial, and racial violence. And it's also more dramatic as we witness this occupation on the east side of Canada from here, wondering about what's happening. But I'm not here to talk about it, though I am here to talk kind of precisely about it. So I hope we'll have the chance to connect my talk to this moment. And I have some quotes that I'll read, but I'll also share a screen with you. Okay. And there are a few quotes which are important in many different ways to what I have to say. And even though I'm not elaborating on them very much in this presentation, beginning with Octavia Butler from Kindred. I treated you good, said Wailing quietly, and you pay me back by stealing from me, stealing my books, reading. He snatched the book from me and threw it on the floor. Then he grabbed me by the arm and dragged me toward the floor. Wailing dragged me a few feet, then pushed me hard. I fell, knocked myself breathless. I never saw where the whip came from, never even saw the first blow coming, but it came like a hot iron across my back, burning into me through my light shirt, searing my skin. I screamed, convulsed. Wailing struck again and again until I couldn't have gotten up at gunpoint. I kept trying to crawl away from the blows, but I didn't have the strength or the coordination to get far. I may have been still screaming or just whimpering, I couldn't tell. All I was really aware of was the pain. I thought Wailing meant to kill me. I thought I would die on the ground there with a mouth full of dirt and blood and a white man cursing and lecturing as he beat me. But then I almost wanted to die, anything to stop the pain. The next quote is from Frederick Douglass from his text, The Color Line from 1871. The slave master interest in describing the Black man as fit to slavery, discrediting the personality of those he held as property. Every man who had $1,000 invested had 1,000 reasons for painting the Black man as fit only for slavery. The holders of $200 million worth of property in human chattels procured the means of influencing press, pulpit, and politician. And through these instrumentalities, they belittled our virtues and magnified our vice and have made us odious in the eyes of the world. Hortense Spillers. a female body shrunk from a tree limb or bleeding from the breast on any given day of a field work because the overseer, standing the length of a whip, has popped her flesh open, adds a lexical and a living dimension to the narratives of women in culture and society. This materialized scene of unprotected female flesh, ungendered, offers a praxis, a theory, a text for living and for dying, and a method for reading both through their diverse mediations. Hortense Spillers. When Barbara Christian asks, what are the philosophical assumptions behind, I'll get out of here, behind my praxis, and we assume that she means that of a Black feminist literary critic, I understand the term behind in two senses. In the sense of that which makes it possible, and in the sense of what would follow her praxis, what would become possible. A Black feminist poetical reading I offer is a version of such praxis, one which attends to both, to what has made it possible and to what it makes possible. Another way of saying it is that it answers to Sojourner Truth's question, and I, woman, by returning to the scene of subjugation, retold in Butler's novel Kindred, returning to what Hortense Spillers calls, and I quote again, the materialized scene of unprotected female flesh. From there, I derive Unpayable Debt as a praxis, a theory, a text, and quoting Spillers, a method for reading. How I do so differs in various degrees from other borrowings and other writings inspired or informed by Truth, Butler's, Christians, and Spillers. There is no room here for even mentioning the actual and possible ways in which I depart from these and other readings, writings. All I can say is that in assembling it, I borrowed and mixed and matched, but always very aware of the implications of what I had to leave behind, what I could not get rid of, and what had to be added or subtracted when combining these different borrowings. Another way of saying that is that Unpayable Debt, as other tools and thought experiments I have devised, Unpayable Debt is hunted from within by its own constituents, but it is also apt at spotting and restraining its inner demons in the same way as it knows how much these may trouble the openings it promises, it makes possible, and it welcomes. A tool for Black thought and an offering to the imagination, Unpayable Debt is also a contribution to the arsenal of the Black radical tradition as described by Cedric Robinson, for whom it includes the anti-slavery and anti-colonial maroon communities and praxis across the Americas and the Caribbean, but also their resonances in the anti-colonial struggles in the European and the African continent, both those that took place in the 20th century, but also those from before. And I would add those yet to come, as well as the ongoing ones. More particularly, this feminist contribution activates Blackness's potential to disrupt post-Enlightenment thought. And in doing so, it is very much in line with Saidiya Hartman's, Fred Moten's, Nahum Chandler's, Alex O'Haley's, Hazel Corby's, Hortense Spillers, Catherine McTrigg's, Christina Sharpe's indirect and direct interrogations of the description for existence that prevailed in the 20th century. And here I'm talking about phenomenology. But it is also informed by the same kind of post-structuralist perspective as these and other Black contemporary thinkers. With a difference, my take on Blackness, like Lyndon Barrett's, has an explicit historical materialist orientation, one which recalls the conditions, let me call them the historical assumptions informing my practice, the conditions that occupied my formative years, political intellectual years in the 1980s in Brazil. In Unpayable Debt, the book about which I'm talking here, condenses and amplifies as it combines lines of reflections and analytical tools in an engagement, different lines of reflections and analytical tools that I developed over the years in engagement with historical materialism, an engagement in which Blackness guides the assembling of the global as a political conceptum, or maybe I should say an engagement with traces how Blackness has guided the assembling of the global as a political concept. This is possible because as a racial category in a manner similar to how indigeneity as well, and also the figures of the refugee and the undocumented migrant, Blackness exposes how coloniality as a juridic modality marked by total violence, how coloniality operates in the extractive and expropriative infrastructures of global capital. However, the particular manner in which Blackness troubles the modern political text as a social scientific category that collapses the moments of the juridical, the moment of juridical as captured by the concepts of sovereignty and law. And Blackness does this collapsing as it exposes how necessity, the opposite of freedom in this discourse, how necessity is inscribed in the post-Enlightenment political architecture. And in doing so, it does something that I call a short circuit of liberty. And it is precisely this short circuit of liberty or of freedom, as folks have been shouting in Ottawa and other places now these days, this short circuit of liberty shows the symbolic as a political moment composed of historic, interpretive, and scientific determinative devices. And in doing so, it also reveals Blackness, its own critical capacity, which invites a shift, a reconfiguring of Blackness itself as a philosophical concept, as a tool of Black thought, which captures how authorized, because necessary, total violence has remained operative in the post-Enlightenment arrangement of the liberal political architecture. Something Blackness does, not by adding or rearranging the modern political text, but by way of its capacity, due to the very intensity of the force that it seems to request, to its capacity to tear the fabric of modern thinking and to release the imagination, which can then explore all that is deemed or rendered impossible under the image of existence that supports the current ethical grammar and the political architecture the latter justifies. So another way of saying what I just said is that the disruptive capacity of Blackness, the political concept, equals the intensity of the violent force with which the self-preserving branches of the liberal authority meet Black persons. It is that disruptive capacity that the phrase Unpayable Debt activates in its operation as a reading tool that functions as Black light. How exactly it does so is something that I'm not addressing in this talk, but of course I'm happy to answer questions about it afterwards. So for today, I'm just describing how Unpayable Debt operates as a Black feminist reading tool. I mean, how it works as an image, and an image here in Walter Benjamin's sense, an image that designed to interrupt the interpretive itinerary, bringing historical, and in doing so, to bring historical signification to a halt. And even if for a moment, as it does so, recalling a figuring of the political that places total violence at its core. So what it does as a reading tool, what Blackness does as a reading tool, is to make visible the global as a political context mapped by the juridical infrastructure of coloniality and the ethical operators of raciality. So I'll share with you some of the moves deployed in the book in the displacing of the prevailing explanation for racial subjugation, which I call the racial dialectic, and then also in the reading of Marx's original presentation of historical materialism. And I will be happy to elaborate why I choose this phrase and not simply Marxism in the description. As an image, Unpayable Debt allows me to read the post-Enlightenment themes of ethical and economic value in a way that shows how their coherence derives from the occlusion of the juridical and economic components. On the one hand, because it recalls total violence, Unpayable Debt does not present racial subjugation as an effect of how a natural racial difference, a natural trait, or an historical substratum, racial differentiation, provoke undesirable mental reactions, like unbecoming moral and intellectual reactions. But what does is to annul the argument that racial difference generates these unbecoming modern subjects. And it does so by bringing out discriminatory and exclusionary ideas and actions in a social space otherwise ruled by the universal principles of equality and liberty, instead by returning Blackness to the scene of subjugation, where Spillers' female flesh engendered under the threat of death and rape, where she exposes how total violence targets the will of the enslaved person, and in doing so also highlighting how it is necessary to the extraction and expropriation of her labor. So that's one difference in this deployment of Blackness. The other side of it, the other hand of it, is that that same wounded female body, producer of both raw materials as worker in the field and the enslaved person as a Black mother, also recalls how in his analysis of the capitalist mode of production, which I call here the original presentation of historical materialism, how Marx's statements on the irrelevance of the colonies and slave labor refer to what he calls the essential conditions the essential social conditions. And as such, the distinction there, the important distinction that Marx, it's not about their subsumption, the subsumption of the colonies and slave labor under a different economic form, but it is also their very placing in a different moment of social existence, one comprehended by juridical and ethical conditions that Marx, in his analysis, leaves undetermined. That is by reading, that is, figuring these statements against the way in which the products of slave labor, raw materials such as cotton and gold or iron, or used to build machines, and the ways in which these products of slave labor are placed as irrelevant to the fact and understanding of capital's reproduction or accumulation of capital, I find that this exclusion is not effectuated in the statements that perform the determination of capital, those of the equation of time, labor, and production of exchange value. Instead, it occurs outside the equation of value, so to speak, as it results from a distinct analytical gesture, which I call delimitation. That is, it is an effect of infinite judgments, which is, the kind of statement that state that something is not part of a set, but does not establish a set to which that same thing belongs. So what I'll do for the most part here is to briefly really describe how Blacklight reads the Marxist version of the scene of economic value, And I do so just to indicate how female flesh and gender recalls it as inseparable from the ethical theme. And then I will close with some comments on the implications I find here for thinking. So I'll go back to my PowerPoint. I'll stay here and then I'll go back to Marx. In what Gayatri Spivak calls her misreadings of the great narratives of European self-representation, I find a move that's key to an anti-colonial Black feminist critique of cis heteropatriarchy, but also for decoding the historical materialism's inheritance. Spivak's reading of Marx's statements on the Asiatic mode of production has inspired the move that sustains my reading of the relations between the colonial, the racial, and capital. Here, in the Marxist version of the economic sin of value, Spiller's female flesh and gender recalls the intractable economic object, both laborer, inhuman, and instrument thing, whose use value, as frequently noted by Marx and as enslaved labor in the plantation, the kitchens, and its, or referring to the slave market, its use value resides in the extraction of the raw materials out of which living labor will produce exchange value. And the raw materials here are cotton, iron ore, gold, tobacco, and all of those we know. So the move that allows for the presentation of the argument here is not so much a misreading as Spivak's, as it is a shift from the question of what Marx said in the original presentation of historical materialism to the question of how he composes the account of capital. So I'm not interested in whether or not I'm getting what Marx meant, right? I spent so many years in such conversations and always found them a bit boring, but the exercise is more about how what is said comes to be, is assembled. And then, of course, I can say a little bit more about why historical materialism now, and then I can say more later, but basically I'm referring to the range of theoretical interventions which were inspired by Gramsci, in particular, but primarily those that focus on the cultural or ideological, or what I call, I use political symbolic to refer to. So primarily, I'm talking about the 20th century focus. Anyway, so when tracking the composition, how Marx put together what he says, I find that capital as a conceptum, by which I mean the delimitation of its reach and the mapping of its operators, such as labor and property. So capital as a conception could only be presented through two analytical gestures. The one that establishes what falls under the concept of capital, that is the determinative statement in which the equation of time, labor, and exchange value is crucial for the scientific presentation of it as an economic concept, and the one that describes the essential social conditions for its emergence. That is what I call the delimitative statements in which ethical, like notions of liberty and self-production, and juridical aspects, juridical such as reference to relations of contract involving free agents, in which those two allow the specification of proper capitalist relations. So what my reading shows is how Marx does not establish to which mode of production the colonies and slave labor belong, what determines them as such, and what plays the role of labor in that mode of production. It is sufficient for him to state that these are not elements of capital, that they do not belong to the set identified the capital. As such, he does not say that they are not capitalist, but that they are non-capitalist. So this kind of negation is not a presentation of the opposite or of a particular, like a different mode of production, but it fits Immanuel Kant's description of infinite judgments, the kind of negation that renders what does not fall under the given concept, in this case, capital, that renders it undetermined. So my reading of Marx's original presentation of historical materialism foregrounds negation, but not in the Spivak's sense of foreclosure, for instance, like of expulsion and disavowal. And there may be several aspects to this difference, not only in distinction of from Spivak's. Then there are other aspects to this distinction, but the one I would like to highlight is precisely that Marx's distinction does not set up a dialectical movement. The colonies are not the order of England, for instance, and slave labor is not the order of wage labor, even though it's so easy to read it that way. So for Marx, they belong to essentially these different social conditions. What they are economically, that remains undetermined in the text. So my main argument in that chapter of the book where I have this distinction is that it is the delimitation of capital as contingent upon globally and historically juridical conditions, in which the prevalence of formal liberty and equality, that limitation which allows for that human's unique capacity, which is produced to transform what's given by nature, one which seems to count for capital only under such formal conditions of liberty. So what the slave produces does not count as exchange value, as the value of the slave is realized when she's bought and not when she works. And that's a crucial moment in the delimitation. And that is, in fact, the only explanation for why slave labor and indigenous lands do not count as productive of capital and are placed in that anterior moment, whether analytically or temporally. That moment when the proper conditions for its inception is assembled, which is, captured by the phrase primitive accumulation. So a moment that, like what Spivak notes in terms of the Asiatic mode of production, a moment that does not belong to history as the temporal dialectical unfolding that leads to capital, nor does it belong to humanity as a figuring of the human as the sole productive existing thing because of its capacity to design and plan. However, it is precisely because it does not belong anywhere, that moment, the one to which female flesh engendered cannot, but recall, while that moment is up for grabs. That is, it's available to the imagination and also, for the colonial critic to take it and run. And that's kind of what I do in the book. But anyway, the crucial move that is that Blackness exposes when it's made, so the crucial move, is to deploy Blackness and in making it shine, to allow it to expose the components of Marx's equation of value, through the components of Marx's equation of value, actually to expose the ways in which slave labor and indigenous lands worked by slave labor participate in the accumulation of capital. I want to go back to this, to the equation of value that I worked through in the chapter. I'll read it so we all know what's in here. By the general law of value, if the value of 40 pounds of yarn equals the value of 40 pounds of cotton plus the value of a whole spindle, i.e., if the same working time is required to produce the commodities on either side of this equation, then 10 pounds of yarn are equivalent to 10 pounds of cotton, together with 1/5 of a spindle. In the case we are considering the same working time is materialized in 10 pounds of yarn on the one hand, and in 10 pounds of cotton, and the fraction of a spindle on the other. Therefore, whether the value appears in, okay, I can't see here, appears in cotton, in a spindle, or in yarn, makes no difference in the amount of that value. The spindle and the cotton, instead of resting quietly side by side, join together in the process. Their forms are altered and they are turned into yarn, but their value is not more affected by this fact than it would be if they had been simply exchanged for their equivalent in yarn. So what I do is to read female flesh ungendered in the cotton balls planted and collected by slaves in Mississippi, and in the iron ore or in the gold mined by slaves in Minas Gerais, Brazil, both of which are used in the production of the spindle living labor uses in the production of the yarn in the factory. And when reading in such a way, ignoring Marx's delimitative statements, as well as his equation of liberty and productivity, which happens when he writes wage labor as a sole producer of value. When doing so, I propose that capital production requires two distinct juridical structures. The colony, in which total violence ensures the appropriation of indigenous territories and extraction of the total value yielded by their lands, and slave labor. And this is the moment I call expropriation. And the other is the polity, the one in which contract, the laws of liberal polity, ensures the appropriation of part of the value produced by wage labor in the factories and elsewhere. And this is what I call exploitation. So what results from this reading of the economic with the ethical scene of values, precisely an exposition of how Blackness, the social category, when released from the racial dialectic, holds the key for reading the global as the post-Enlightenment political context, as the conjunct operations of the colonial racial cis-heteropatriarchal matrix in all of its moments, that is an economic, juridical, and symbolic. So another way of saying that, which I hope, it may not be as evident here, but I hope the book makes more evident. Unpayable Debt's primarily effect is to redecompose the post-Enlightenment political architecture as it exposes the fissures that signal how Blackness as a global conception does both sustain the reproduction of global capital and the physical of the human and non-human components, violations it requires, and how we exist in it, and also allows us to peer through these same fissures and envision the kind of shift at the level of thinking needed for an ethical political program for existing otherwise in this planet. Thing and human, female flesh ungendered, recalls, sorry, I want to move it here. Female flesh ungendered recalls this intractable condition that figures the political through total violence, rape or murder, that is present in every scene of beating. The threat of total violence is operative in the corner where the ethical and economic scenes of value unfold. In the ethical scenes, it is seen as necessary for controlling the will of the enslaved person, which has to be there precisely because that control can never be assured. The owner or overseer can never be sure that a slave cries, laughs, or works out of obedience or as a deception. They're just pretending. That undeterminability also precludes an account of the enslaved as a subject of desire, that which keeps her off the scene, that keeps her off the scene of subjectivity, but keeps her in the scene of citizenry as a subject of will. She is a political entity. What the reading exposes is how that undeterminability marks her existing as thing, and human, but does not signal a double or a duality that has to be highlighted. That undeterminability, to the extent that it is an aporia, it is so as a distinctive aspect of material existence when approached obviously quantically, which is that every movement of determinacy exposes its dependence on linearity, which made explicit as a violation of the limitations of space-time, of entanglement, or which that indeterminability makes explicit as in terms of the limitations of space-time, in terms of entanglement, but also in regards to infinity. So when addressed as such, as the human, as an existence, even as she remains a person, a body-mind composite, she's above all, because of at the elemental level of her composition, she's above all like everything else that exists, while being also at the same time a human. So I'm just gonna comment briefly, I hope, on the shifts at the level of thinking Unpayable Debt hopes to inspire. Each will be described in reference to commonly known philosophical terms because this is the level at which the image has its effects. This does not mean that Unpayable Debt is not concerned or is not relevant to consideration of real world issues. I think the opposite, as I said earlier, the image itself comes out of an effort to show the connections between local and global events and racial and colonial subjugation, and is meant as a critical racial and anti-colonial feminist analytical tool, which recalls significant real political economic events with a global reach, namely the Latin American economic crisis of 1980s, the global economic crisis of 2007 and 2008. And I'm saying that because the phrase I initially used it in the special issue on the global economic crisis that, in the introduction to the special issue on the global economic crisis that I co-authored with Paula Chakravarty. But anyway, so when it makes the connections, Unpayable Debt works as a Black feminist reading tool. And so it functions as Black light, which is the only means for making that which had to be occluded for the world to make sense, to make visible what renders these connections between the racial, the colonial, and the state capital visible. And as Black light, while it makes the opaque, the occluded shine, the figure that drives this reading, the reading in Unpayable Debt, also exposes the code, that is the philosophical grounds expressed in the interest structures of post-Enlightenment thinking. And these I refer as the onto-epistemological descriptors, formality and efficacy, the onto-epistemological pillars, separability, determinacy, and sequentiality, and other actually infrastructure elements that compose our descriptive, reflective, determinative, and speculative tools. As it fails to fit in the first distinction, the court's mind and body, as figured in Kant's man, human, and thing, female flesh and gender opens a space for thinking that does not have to, perhaps cannot, even because it fails the first test of separability, it does not have to make claims to certainty or to the certainty of the separation, and consequently does not need of the principle of identity equality to support its intuitive statement. That, I think, opens up possible points of departure for thinking other than the still prevailing transcendentality, whether formal Kant or final, a final cause as Hegel's. That has obvious consequences to the main presumption of transparency, both of the knowing subject with itself and its engaging with the world as other subjects, as its mirror or its more or less distorted images, mirror images. So what becomes possible here is to engage subjectivity, the ontological presentation of the human globally. By that I mean as the defining mode of existence of the human being, as well as temporality and historicity as its horizon, and also to engage subjectivity racially, in the sense of highlighting how it's restricted to white European bodies and territories. And that, I think, is an argument David Lloyd advances in his book, Under Representation. At the same time, the whole expanse of existence, what's called natural world, that is human and non-human existence, and the planet itself may be released from the hold of the knowing subject as the experimental results of particle physics and cosmology, and also the theoretical tools of quantum field theory indicate. For once, it is not possible to assert the what of something in terms of a unity, of that it is separate from something, and how exactly it is separate from others. And then if it's not possible to do so intuitively, failing the test of separability, or experientially, so the particles, quantum particles' failure to obey space-temporal separation and entanglement. So the other onto-epistemological pillars, determinacy and sequentiality, as well as the descriptors, formality and efficacy, no longer have a grasp of sense in terms of comprehensibility. And the point of departure for describing all that exists, every and each existence, becomes ontological indeterminacy, and here I'm thinking with Karen Barad, and deep implicancy, which is the term I use for what physicists call entanglement. So this breaking apart of the post-Enlightenment onto epistemological infrastructures has many consequences. The most important of them, I find, is that without the separation between man, human, humanity, and thing, separation between subjectivity and world, actually, once the fundamentally violent bases and effects of such separation are exposed and we contemplate them, the question is raised as to how then to reconstitute the ethical, the domain of thinking that has applied exclusively to the human as person, not to the human as conceived as individual and social entity. It is here that female flesh and gender does most of her work when she is focused as black light. She dissolves the infrastructures of thinking that compose the ethical and economic scenes of value, and shows how the ethical and economic, as well as the symbolic and the juridic at play, they do so in tandem with each other, within each other, not with each other. For the move that shows the colonial visions is heteropatriarchal operating within the various moments of the post-Enlightenment political architecture, that move also invites reflection on how else to devise and apply descriptive terms that figure existence in a way that takes into account the complexity female flesh and gender reviews. And then, of course, that's a task to come. So I'm just going to conclude now. Unpayable debt is a phrase, an image, an invitation, and a dare. And as such, it recalls refusal in many senses, but very directly, as in the daring to say the unspeakable and to mean the incomprehensible. It also recalls Dana Butler's character I read at the beginning, Dana's refusal to comply to the order of not read, which back then there in antebellum Maryland also meant to steal from the slave owner. As a Black feminist poetical tool, Unpayable Debt reflects that which it has been devised to expose. As a reading tool, Unpayable Debt performs the gestures related to this task. It is a study, it assesses from a particular point of view as it probes, goes through the post-Enlightenment arrangement of the economic and the ethical themes of value. But as it does so, it functions as an extracting device, like scanning with ultraviolet rays. It extracts, interprets, and breaks, recomposes the codes in the computing sense, which is also the way we describe DNA's function. The codes that establish how these themes are composed, what belongs to them, and how the theme, the ethical and the economic theme of value works. It is Unpayable Debt is a Black feminist reading tool, an analytical device, which in daring to deal with the intractable, in daring to bring out female flesh and gendered. In doing so, it means the incomprehensible and contemplates the yet unimaginable. And in that contemplation, it exposes coloniality as a juridical modality and raciality as a symbolic arsenal, both of them integral components of the post-Enlightenment political architecture, and as such as crucial to the functions of the state and the reproduction or the accumulation of capital in the global present. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, thank you so much. That was amazing, stimulating lecture. Professor Da Silva is ready to entertain questions. If you have questions, she has asked that you put them in the chat, please, but you can also speak your question aloud as well. So in the chat and speaking. So no, don't be shy.
But it's fine. It's good to take some time.
Hey, Mary, is that your hand up or is that an applause?
Oh, Mary, you're mute. I don't know if that was. Okay.
There, I'm trying to write in the chat as well. I have just a couple of not well formulated questions. The first is just to ask if you could more sort of concisely summarize the difference that your reading of Marx, which I found very interesting, what difference it makes to our understanding of Black female subjectivity and experience or existence, because it was that connection I was having a hard time making. I could follow what you were saying about Marx, but I wasn't sure about the connection. And then the second question I have is, and this is probably not directly relevant, but I've been troubled over the last couple of years by the use of racialized X, and what's happened, at least here in Canada, is that whereas racialized used to try to point to the fact that white was racialized as was Black, etc., that racialization was a sort of dialectical or dynamic process. What's happened is that now the term racialized has come to apply only to those who are sometimes known as people of color. including, of course, Indigenous people. And I was just wondering if you have any reflections on that, because you have talked about the sort of illuminating power of Blackness, which I love because it's a way of critiquing Enlightenment discourse. But I was just wondering if you could reflect on that as well.
Thanks, Maddie, for both questions. And for asking them. To your first question, it's kind of the opposite. It's not so much that Marxism illuminates or allows us to understand more about the Black female subjectivity and existence or experience. Is actually the Black female as a figure, what becomes of Marxism when read through her, in particular in the figure that I tried to, convey at the beginning through Octavia Butler's character, Sojourner Truth question, and Hortense Spillers, right? And then the reference through Douglas. So the question that I explore and experiment with in the book, but more in particular in that chapter, is a question that, what if we looked at Marx's equation, right? That description of the general law of value, and through the cotton, and paid attention to the cotton, and through the cotton, we saw not only, the enslaved laborer, but that particular scene of forced labor, which is the scene of subjugation. What happens to then? What would happen to our to the very? I mean, not so much to the capital as a concept itself, because the concept is limited in so many different ways, even before Marx, right? I mean, limited because of what I call the onto-epistemological interest structures that rendered it possible as a concept. But what would happen of our account of power in general, in all its moments, including the economic, right, but also the ethical, juridical, and the symbolic. Actually, one of the things that happens is that you cannot separate the ethical and the economic, and you cannot separate the juridical in looking at Marx's account. And then if you then go beyond through the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, we realized that we can't also ignore the discursive elements, to use Foucault, right? The historical and scientific tools that we use for describing our existence, including, the dear social categories that name my institute. So, so that's the shift. So shifting from which is, to me, is a generational one. I was trained to look at and attempt to find appropriate descriptors for the Black female subjectivity and the Black female experience. But I found that more interesting exercise is to take that experience as the point of departure for the critique, instead of taking existing critical tools for understanding it, because those critical tools they always go back to some version of racial subjugation anyway, at the level of the symbolic, right? So, but that's also something we can elaborate. As to racialized, I don't use the term. I think I have used it maybe 2 or 3 times, because I just thought, okay, I'm just going to use it, so I don't have to explain. So I prefer to use racial subjugation, and the reason why is very much the same as what I was saying just before, because, as you described, racialized has become a descriptor for people who are racially subjugated, right? BIPOC populations, and then I use it as a shortcut, and others, I'm sure they use it as a shortcut, so we don't need to be reciting, because it's painful to recite racial subjugation and all its aspects. But what I like to highlight is and here I'm thinking with Glenn Coulthard, my colleague here, to the dimension of the relations, right? That is when we use the term racialized as a descriptor, racialization still allows us for something, but even though not, but when you use racialized as a descriptor, we kind of take the attention from the political element in it, which is given by the relation. By the relation of power, and with all these different aspects. So I use racial subjugation, but I do understand why racialized has become, the term of use, because I know exactly when I found myself like, I'm going to say racialized, to convey the message quicker. But thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we have a question in the chat. I'll just read it out loud for everybody. It's thanks for the excellent talk, Denise. I have a note from your class that says that the concept of an anti-dialectical image appears in Unpayable Debt, and I've been anxiously awaiting the opportunity to read the book ever since. When you refer to Unpayable Debt as a Benjaminian image, as an interruption, is it in this sense? And if it is an anti-image, does the critical force amount to the illumination of the occluded that you described?
Thank you, Paula, for reading. Was it Paula reading? Yes, and thank you, Dominic, for the question. Yeah, so Unpayable Debt, it became itself. Well, okay, so the book has its secrets, and I'm not giving one of them up here. That is somebody else in that book that I'm not talking about, and I'm not going to talk about that. It should keep something should stay there and show up when the book comes out. So, but yes, as I did say that is before, that it's the images in the book, and they Unpayable Debt itself as an image, but then the images that I actually, or the main image I present in the book, I thought of them as anti-dialectical. But what's interesting is that I also, because of the time that it took to write the book, and I have to say that the class teaching that seminar was really helpful in this exercise. But what is also what came out of it was, on the one hand, the movement, the image that really interrupts sequentiality, but it does so in the form of, as I described before, as black light, as literally returning the very movement. So okay, so if the Hegelian dialectic is primarily about that violence that is constitutive of spirit, it is as if spirit is always violating itself, becoming, becoming or recognizing itself as a material force and taking it back. And that is that necessarily violent movement in the self-production of the movement of the Hegelian spirit, which for Marx then is the other way around, right? So that fundamentally violent moment is what he's highlighting. So we have these two versions of the dialectic, one in which the violence is constitutive and self-producing, the other one in which the violence is still necessary, but it will lead to the disappearance of the difference. That's Marx's. So what Unpayable Debt, what I do with that figure I'm not naming here in Unpayable Debt is say, stay in that movement, and in that moment of violence, just sends the violence back, the intensity of the violence back. analytically, and in doing so, it breaks the code. So it's not only that it stops the movement, but actually it sends that, it is still very Marxist in a way, because it is so about stopping, interrupting that logic and exposing that which renders the very movement of power possible. And then it's not that it stops it, but it no longer can no longer be sustained in the same very ways. So that's how it does what it does, that stopping, that halting. And so so it is the force is the illuminating force of UV rays, right? The ultraviolet rays, which is to make visible that which is opaque, but also to bring the transformation or a redecomposition at the level of the code. And not only, it's truly fully material, but it's not only so if we keep substance, this image of form and content, it brings black illumination. The black light works through, if it is allowed to stay there and focus, it will bring a transformation at the level of the code. And we can name it different things because it's no longer, can be just transformation, but can also be named differently. I call it redecomposition. And that's how I can answer your question without giving away too much.
Thank you very much. We have another question, and it says, thanks for your lecture. I'm particularly interested in your reading of Marx. Did you say that the value of the slave's labor and expropriated land is set at the point of purchase rather than that of production? If so, I can see how this applies to slave labor, but not to the expropriated lands. So could you elaborate on this point in your lecture?
Yes, thank you, Paul, again, and thank you, Uzoma, for the question. No, I didn't say that. Marx said that. So I was quoting him in that passage, and that's a crucial passage in this distinction between wage labor and slave labor, and it is one of the crucial passages that, for me, allow for the distinction between the two kinds of statements. This is a delimitative statement because what precedes and follows that statement is the fact that the value of the slave, because the value of the slave of slave labor of the slave is set in the moment of it at the market as the value of a commodity, right? As a value of a thing that it's brought and sold. It's not about the value of the slave as a laborer, which is the use value of, which should be the use value of the slave, right? Which is the use value of the labor is the production of exchange value. That just doesn't count because of the distinction between these two juridical moments. Because of this juridical distinction, or because of the distinction between these two juridical figures: title, which describes the slave in the market, and contract, which describes the wage labor in the market, right? So that is, that's what I'm highlighting in mentioning that. So I'm highlighting, but I didn't spend any time explaining why I made the reference, because when I ignore that distinction, which is referred in this passage from Marx, what I can do is to then look at the cotton as, as having a value, an exchange value, because I call it raw materialism somewhere, because having an exchange value that is both which refers to both the productive capacity of enslaved labor and the productive capacity of indigenous lands, right? Because when the cotton doesn't count in the production of exchange value of the commodity, it's saying, right, neither the indigenous lands nor the slave labor have any value in the accumulation of capital. They play no role. So ignoring that distinction, is a way of, reading indigenous lands and enslaved labor in the accumulation of capital. And since capital is nothing more than its accumulation in time, it is reading indigenous land and enslaved labor in the very, in the computer I'm using to do my work here, right? Because this is accumulated capital, and accumulated this is the logic of the argument. Where the argument goes is towards a claim for reconstruction or the return of the value yielded by indigenous lands and enslaved labor. But I'm just going off the subject now.
Thank you very much. Corinne, do you want to say your question yourself?
You can say it. I like it when you say it.
Okay. All right, well, so Corinne says, thank you so much. I understood that in the beginning of your presentation, you were speaking about Black feminist practices as that which makes it possible and that which makes it possible. And that for Spillers, this was a method for reading. Could you elaborate on this?
Thank you, Corinne and Paula. Again, so for the Spillers, the method is there, which is it's painfully beautiful, right? Because it is female flesh and gendered. That is the method, right? And then of course, for me, I never asked Hortense Spillers what she meant, right? I just took it and I mean it in the ways in which I have been going about designing the method and then applying the method. So for me, the figure, female flesh and gendered is a method in the sense, in the very sense that I was describing. It's kind of difficult to talk about and not, instead of just doing it, in the sense that, one way in which, one way, it's not general, it's just one way. One way in which that method is there is so we talk about racial violence, we protest against racial violence. And here I'm thinking about racial colonial violence. So I'm talking about police killing of Black persons, but I'm also talking about the murder and disappearance and total indifference to what happens to indigenous women, right? It's all colonial racial violence also, in addition to being cis heteropatriarchal. So we talk about, we attend to racial violence, colonial violence, and it seems that we have two possible responses that end up being very limited. One is to look at the larger, because we're talking about violence, right? So it's a political infrastructure, a larger political infrastructure, which is too far away from, to use a term that helps a lot, BIPOC populations, because, like we see those people occupying Ottawa in the name of their liberty, you gotta have liberty to make that mess, right? So to us, it's like, you can't even think about it. The police, they're gonna get you, right? You don't even go there. So the political is always associated with those who can go there and protest and not being arrested, no? And then we have to do quite a lot of work to get there, but usually we never get there because we always stay at some kind of, at some description of the relation that it's not violent, but it's just exclusionary, right? You're just excluded, discriminated, but the violence that is, that more political, and I'm using political here in reference to the state, the settler colonial state of Canada or the US, etc. So that is that. Or we look at the violence in terms of its impact on BIPOC populations, and then you look at the victim and the suffering And again, you don't talk about the larger political context. So to me, female flesh and gender, that body exposes that connection between that larger political structure and the person here, and what's happening to that person here, without resolving, and postpones what is usually immediate, and actually hopefully also not only postpones, but doesn't allow the victim to come in, because what happens to the victim is that she becomes always the responsible for her own misery, right? She's always blamed for it, racially or in this or through the cis heterosexual matrix. So that's the method. It's a method that takes that body, and instead of staying with the violence, but looking at the kind of bad social subject that violence creates, which is what sociology of race relations and critical ethnic studies have done consistently, it returns it to where it should be, which are the larger structures that mediate the relations, the structures that authorized, white Canadian citizens to kill Indigenous women because they know they are not going to be held accountable. That is with the settler colonial state. That is what allows for that. Or the one that authorized the cops to, enter somebody's house in Minneapolis and kill him just because they knew the law is on their side, right? I mean, so so her body, that violated body about which we don't want to talk, that we are told not to mention, that body to me is a point of departure for that engagement, and not staying, that other thing.
Thank you so much.
So if we have any other questions, please put them in the chat. Mary, I'm not sure if the text that you wrote, for me, it's showing up as a series of pluses. I'm not sure if that's the case for everyone else, but if I can't read it at least. So if you have another question that you'd like to ask, please go ahead. And you're muted.
Yes, well, sorry, I didn't mean to write anything at all, but I have been sort of brooding about another question. And I guess it's this notion of a point of departure. I'm slowly beginning to understand the structure of your argument. And I really like the way in which postponing certain moves is compatible with taking the Black female subject as the point of departure. I think that's a really fascinating and beautiful sort of structure. But I guess the question I was asking was about codes. Why you're using the language of codes and the idea of sort of breaking or shattering the codes. And I noticed that earlier you were talking about the conventions of theory or theoretical conventions. But when you're talking about racism and racialized exploitation and subjugation, you use codes. So I just wanted to hear your response to that.
Okay, thank you, Mary, for the comments and the questions. So there are two things there in the use of code, maybe three. One is a more general and the least relevant to what we are doing here, which is a conversation I'm having with some friends who are tech and write about computers, algorithms, and some things. That is that conversation, and in that conversation, it is reference to code is both about the ways in which it is an infrastructure, right? the infrastructure of separability, determinacy, but also raciality itself, the racial representation itself is part of our infrastructure, and it is in the code. So, you know, demands for less racist codes in, you know, talking about this, about social media in general, or about different computer environments we are into, you know, online environments, demanding for more inclusion in the same code is not going to be enough. So that is that conversation. But that conversation is also tied to maybe a more specific, okay, this can get very, even more abstract than it is already. So bear with me. And then if it doesn't make sense, we can always have the conversation some other time. So,
Sure.
okay, so in that conversation with the tech people, I'm also, what is implied there is, you know, what I call these onto-epistemological descriptors, formality and efficacy, which are descriptors that you find them, I don't know, back with Galileo, but it's only like in the late 18th century that they really become inscribed in modern philosophy, in the Kantian program. And I'm not going to repeat what he says, but I'm just going to say it is, and you just believe me because it's true. It is inscribed in there, but then it is, because it is inscribed in the framework that still pretty much governs our thinking, including our critical thinking. So formality and efficacy, those two aspects are presumed they are operative in our descriptions in our critiques, right? So for instance, talking about racial subjugation, the prevailing explanation for racial subjugation that I call the racial dialectic, and I kind of mentioned it in the talk, but I can repeat it. It assumes that, there are those people, those Black and Asian people and the indigenous peoples. They come into these social spaces inhabited by white people, and white people don't really understand them and don't quite, cannot relate to their beliefs and their ideas, and look at them and see their physical traits as reference to their different moral and intellectual traits. And then white people discriminate against them, and that discrimination, exclusion, actually force those people to maintain their unique traits, and the thing keeps going back. So that's the racial dialectic. Now, what the logic there is that the cause for exclusion and discrimination is something that you find in the Black and brown and Asian people, right? It's in there, it's not in the general context. So that explanation is inscribed in every concept and formulation we have for addressing racial subjugation. And it presupposes an efficacy, right? You have the forms of the body. Okay, it presupposes formality in the sense that the body becomes this, in its form, becomes an expression of a content, different moral, moral and intellectual characteristics. If there is the presumption that those the physical traits of, and it's not only about the visible ones, because I'm talking about racial science of the 19th century too, that those physical traits, they somehow, okay, yeah, oh no, I'm not gonna go there, go back here. And then those physical traits are the ones that cause those reactions. There is an efficacy of the traits, right? So there's formality and efficacy is operating in that explanation. And every time we use the concepts, categories that that were produced under those conditions, we are repeating this idea of a form that express or is expressed by certain material elements, and then the efficacy, the fact that it causes something, is an efficient cause. So now I don't even remember why I needed that example, but just trying to go back to responding to your comment. Then these, okay, so our critical apparatus carries this presumption that forms express or indicate something interior, and that expression has an effect. And that those two descriptors, oh, wow. I mean, we live in a world that it's being built by those two descriptors. But one important aspect of this, especially of efficacy, is that violence becomes both natural and expected, right? That because it also comes with, you know, the idea that the proper modern subject or any proper modern anything is marked by liberty or freedom, or better, I prefer to call it self-determination, which means we describe the world as a world of efficacy in which everything is affecting everything else, and that's bad. And we claim that the best of the world is the one in which everything is self-determined, with the best of the human world. So I think I can't say more about it because it's going to take too long, but that is a fundamental problem in our critical tools because they're made out of this contradiction. And that which, anyway, okay, so I'll stop. That is another one, but I'm not going to even go there. But those two, I think, should give a sense of why I'm interested in the code. I mean, in that sense, the code is a very general, you know, name for formal efficacy, I'll call it, as a trait.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. We're really getting into some difficult and wonderful materials.
Thank you.
So if there are any other questions, if you'd like to put them in the chat. We may have tired Denise out.
Yeah, it doesn't appear that there are any more questions. So last chance, guys, to ask something. And you can speak it. You don't have to put it in the chat at this point. Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions, let's all thank Denise Ferreira da Silva for this stimulating, fantastic talk. And we look forward to reading the book when it comes out. Very excited.
Thank you for staying, for your questions, your patience. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
everyone for coming.